Good evening. I would like to first extend my thanks on behalf of the New York State Museum and the State Education Department for all of you for coming out on this brisk winter evening. My name's Aaron Noble. I'm the Senior Historian for Political and Governmental History here at the New York State Museum, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers tonight. Our first speaker, Steve Lockman, is the New York State Museum's first curator of sports. Since his appointment to that position 6 years ago, he has researched and presented on automobile racing, basketball, and the Olympics in New York State. Further, under Lockman's direction, the museum's sports collection has expanded exponentially, including some of the artifacts that he'll be talking about and that you'll be able to see tonight. So with that, Steve Lockman.
Thank you, Aaron. So I'm going to just briefly talk about Babe Ruth and do a little bit of show and tell, and then I'll let Rob talk. So let's get started. Babe, the Great Bambino, he was born February 6, 1895 in Baltimore, Maryland. For better or for worse, he was a juvenile delinquent. He ran the streets. His parents owned a bar, and he was known to sneak beers in the bar and was really kind of running around rough. His parents didn't really know what to do with him, so they sent him away to an all-boys school called St. Mary's Industrial School for the Boys. And that is where Ruth learned how to play baseball, and that is where he got discovered. And when he was 19, he signed his first professional contract with the Baltimore Orioles. At that time, the Orioles were a minor league team. There was another professional team in Baltimore, the Baltimore Terrapins, and they kind of dominated the market. So the Orioles, in kind of financial straits, sold Ruth off to the Boston Red Sox. And it was at the Red Sox where he really kind of developed into the professional player that he became. His first couple years in Boston, he was a pitcher, and he was a very good pitcher. In 1916, he led the league in ERA with a 1.75 ERA, and he led the league in wins. He was 23-12. So very good numbers for a lefty pitcher. In 1918, the World Series, he threw 29 2/3 consecutive scoreless innings. That's a record that stood for 40 years. And as good of a pitcher as he was, he got bored of only playing 4 days, or every 4 days or 5 days, which is kind of mind-blowing because he was really good. And because of World War I, there was a lack of talent in the major leagues, and he was able to convince his manager at the time to let him play every day. And that is where he kind of became the Great Bambino and started hitting home runs. His breakout season hitting home runs, he hit 29 in 1919. And to put that in context, the player who had the second most home runs in the American League that year, a Philadelphia Philly named Gavy Carath, he had 12. But his time with the Red Sox was short-lived, and I think this is where the folklore of Babe Ruth comes into play. He was famously sold from the Red Sox to the Yankees. Everybody kind of, the story goes he was sold so that the Red Sox owner could finance a play. No, Nanette. That's actually not true. He was sold to finance the purchase of Fenway Park. At the time, the current owner of the Red Sox at the period didn't own the park, the previous owner did, and to finance the purchase, he sold off Ruth and other baseball players. Ruth's first year with the Yankees, he had 54 home runs, so he basically doubled his total from his time with the Red Sox. The following year, he hit 59, and he led the Yankees to their first pennant. And in 1923, he hit 59 home runs. There we go. And he led the Yankees to their first World Series. He won the MVP in 1923, and he led the league in runs, home runs, RBIs, walks, and slugging percentage. It was a dominating season for Ruth, and he was unanimously voted MVP. Also in 1923 was the birth of Yankee Stadium. Previously, the Yankees had played at the Polo Grounds. They shared it with the Giants. The Giants owned the Polo Grounds. With the popularity of Ruth and the Yankees, they kind of wanted to kick him out. And so the Yankees began building Yankee Stadium. They tailored the baseball park to Ruth. They had a short porch in right field that really helped out left-handed power hitters, and it's still that way today. You kind of look at the history of the Yankees, there's a lot of left-handed power bats. And the short porch in right field and the bleachers was known as Ruthville. Yankee Stadium was the first sports stadium to feature three-tiered seating, so 3 levels. It was, at the time when it was built, it was twice as big as any other baseball stadium in the country because of Ruth's popularity. The State Museum is lucky to have in our collections a pair of seats from the original Yankee Stadium, and we have a ticket booth from the original Yankee Stadium as well. That's the red structure that's kind of in pieces with spray paint on it. When Yankee Stadium closed for the first time in '73 and was renovated, that was when our ticket booth was taken down, so it is still as it was in 1973. And the hope one day is that we restore it and it comes on display at the museum, hopefully one day. That's the plan. Obviously, most people know Ruth as the home run king, the great Bambino, the Sultan of SWAT. 1927, he hit 60 home runs, breaking his record from 1921 of 59. He wasn't on pace to break his 59 home run record from 21 until he went on a tear in September of that year. He hit 16 home runs in September. That record stood until 1961 when Roger Maris passed him, hitting 61 home runs. Ruth ended his career with 714 home runs, third all-time behind Hank Aaron and Barry Bonds. Ruth led the American League in home runs 12 times during his career, and he was the first player to ever hit a home run in an All-Star game in 1933. There's Roger at Monument Park looking at Ruth, looking kind of scared. The 1927 New York Yankees were called Murderers Row, probably the best baseball team ever assembled. They had 6 Hall of Famers. The 1927 Yankees were the first team to ever feature a pair of teammates to hit over 30 home runs. Ruth hit 60. Lou Gehrig hit 47 that year. The 27 Yankees won the World Series in a straight sweep. The 28 Yankees won the World Series in a straight sweep. And Ruth's last appearance in the World Series was in 1932. And part of the folklore that I think a lot of us know who research baseball is the famous called shot, which may or may not have happened. It's a good story. That was in Game 3 of the 1932 World Series against the Chicago Cubs. There's a lot of animosity between those teams. Probably what happened was Ruth was exchanging words with the Cubs dugout and was pointing towards the Cubs, but the newspapers at the time ran away with the story of Ruth calling his shot, hitting a home run. That was his last home run that he hit in a World Series. He had 15 career World Series home runs, second all-time behind Mickey Mantle. Ooh, there we go. Ruth and the Yankees split in 1935. Ruth really wanted to become a manager, and he never got the opportunity to become a manager. His youth as a juvenile delinquent, he never really grew up. He was always very childlike. He was very rambunctious. He liked to party. He liked to have a good time. And the famous quote, to paraphrase, was, "How can he look after a team when he can't look after himself?" So in 1935, he spent his he only played for about a half a season with the Boston Braves. His body was falling apart. He couldn't really play the outfield. He was told that he could potentially move to the front office, maybe become a manager, but he quickly found out that the Braves were using him basically to sell tickets. And he left baseball at that point. He was a member of the first Baseball Hall of Fame class in 1936. And in 1938, he got a chance to coach a little bit for the Brooklyn Dodgers. It's very weird seeing Ruth in a Braves uniform and a Dodgers uniform. He was only with the Dodgers for about a half a season, and he left because he they weren't going to make him a manager. That year, they hired Leo DeRocher after the season to become manager, and he was with the Dodgers for a while. Ruth went to Cooperstown in 1939. There's a very famous photo of the inaugural class. The first Hall of Fame class was in 36, but they didn't actually open the Hall of Fame to 39. So 39, they had a huge ceremony in Cooperstown for all the players that had been inducted over the years. Now I get to talk about the fun stuff, the show and tell. So this summer, the New York State Museum was very lucky to acquire a very significant sports collection. And one of the pieces that was in that collection was a baseball that may or may not have been signed by Babe Ruth. Towards the end of Babe Ruth's life, he worked for the Ford Motor Company, who was a big sponsor of American Legion baseball at the time. And he would travel around the country. He would talk to the kids. He, like I said before, he was very childlike, so he really enjoyed talking to the youth. And part of his deal with Ford and working with the American Legion was he would go to state championship games. And the winners of those state championship games would get a full-size baseball signed by Babe Ruth, and the runners-up would get a smaller souvenir-sized baseball that has a signature that looks like Ruth's, but so far none have ever been completely confirmed as being a Babe Ruth signature. It's what they call in the sports memorabilia world a secretarial signature. So it could have been Ruth, it could have been one of his handlers because he was so flooded with autograph requests. He only worked for Ford Motor Company for 2 years before he passed away from cancer in 1948. So that's the ball, and the ball is actually on the table. So after we get done talking, I'll be over at the table and we can talk about the Babe Ruth baseball. And that ball there down in this corner, that's another one of the secretarial signed baseballs. It's a little better condition so you can kind of see what the signature and the markings would look like. Also in that collection, other Yankee memorabilia that was included, there was a great collection of letters between Peter Golenbach, who wrote a book about the Yankees called Yankee Dynasty. And there's a bunch of letters between him and old baseball players that played for the Yankees during the 40s and 50s. The letter up there is from Frank Crosetti, who actually played with Babe Ruth. I think that was the oldest letter that was in that collection. Signed photo of Mickey Mantle, lots of autographed baseballs. That's probably a third of the baseballs that came in that collection. You can see Mel Stoudemire. There's Don Larson up there, Joe DiMaggio, Dave Winfield, Yogi Berra. Lots of great baseballs in there, and bobbleheads and other sports memorabilia, including pieces from the Knicks, the Rangers, the Mets, the Brooklyn Dodgers, the Giants. A really terrific collection. So I brought some tonight, so on your way out, take a look, and I'll be over there as well. So if you want to chat, be happy to. And with that, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Before I introduce our featured speaker tonight, I just want to mention the museum will be offering CTLE credit for the online version of this talk. If there happen to be any educators in the audience, please see Catherine Weller, our Director of Education, and we'll get your name and make sure you get credit for being here tonight. Dr. Robert Childs graduated summa cum laude from Towson University in 2004 with a Bachelor of Science in Music and received his PhD in History from the University of Maryland in 2012. He is presently a senior lecturer at the University of Maryland. His research focuses on U.S. politics and society in the 19th and 20th centuries, particularly from the Gilded Age to World War II. Dr. Childs became a research associate in history with the New York State Museum in 2021. He is co-editor of New York History Journal, a member of the editorial board of the Hudson River Valley Review, and host of Empire State Engagements. He has written numerous pieces on New York State history, including his first book, The Revolution of '28, Al Smith, American Progressivism and the Coming of the New Deal, which was published in 2018 by Cornell University's Press, as well as articles in Environmental History, the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, New York History, and op-ed pieces for Newsday, the New York Daily News, and the Albany Times-Union. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight Dr. Robert Childs.
Well, thank you, Aaron, for your generous introduction. Thank you, Steve, for your fascinating presentation. I got a sneak peek of some of this back in the summer, which is exciting. I also want to thank publicly some of my colleagues who helped to get the word out about this, including my colleagues from the Journal, not only Aaron, but also our esteemed state historian, Devin Lander, who's here, and in particular, the person who really made this happen tonight, Dr. Jennifer Lemack, who even though she's not able to be here, I want to say on the record, she went to extraordinary lengths to make this event happen, and I'm grateful for her kindness and really support for my career for the last decade or more. Also new friends, thank you, Catherine, for your help making this happen. And I'm grateful to all of you for showing up. It means a great deal to get to talk about this to people. To start off tonight, I want everyone to imagine it's a sunny 86-degree afternoon. All right. So it's unseasonably warm for St. Louis in October, but there we are with a bright blue October sky at Sportsman's Park in St. Louis, Missouri. With 2 out in the bottom of the ninth, and an increasingly hostile crowd heckling the visiting outfielders, St. Louis Cardinals captain Frankie Frisch popped up along the left field line. As the ball descended toward the box seats, New York Yankees star Babe Ruth trotted in pursuit. And I'll say parenthetically, I know what you're thinking, he's a right fielder. He did actually not most of the time, but often play left field, including this day. So anyway, he raised his glove, snagged the foul ball at the edge of the bleachers to record the final out in Game 4 of the 1928 World Series. For the second consecutive year and the third time that decade, the Yankees were champions of the world. It was fitting that Ruth, who never lost his stride after gathering the ball in, and ran to the New York bench, waving the ball in the air and laughing at the hostile crowd. It was fitting that Babe Ruth should snare the final fly, for he had delivered a remarkable series, setting 19 records during the 4-game affair, in which he hit .625, scored 9 runs, drove in 4, hit 3 doubles, and in the final game belted 3 home runs. It was fitting, too, because Babe Ruth was not merely the brightest star on the field. He was also among the biggest celebrities in the country. And the champion had more than baseball on his mind as he returned home to Gotham. When the victorious Yankees train pulled into Grand Central Terminal on October 10th, Babe Ruth led a band of teammates snaking through a cacophonous crowd of 3,000 adoring New Yorkers. Ruth and first baseman Lou Gehrig were repeatedly singled out for particular ovations by the crowd, but retreating from the exultant mayhem of the midtown streets below, Ruth's first stop on his triumphant return to New York was political. He proceeded to the Biltmore Hotel at Madison Avenue and 43rd Street to the campaign headquarters of Governor Alfred E. Smith, New York's 4-term chief executive and the Democratic nominee for the presidency that year. Bursting into Smith's suite, Ruth blasted his unmistakably hearty greetings to the governor, who beamed. Well, I'm certainly glad to see you, Babe. I'm not going to try and do an Al Smith impression. That would be in poor taste. He slapped the slugger on the back and dubbed him the boss of the youth of America. Ruth autographed the ball he had snagged to clinch the series and presented this trophy to his governor. He also introduced Lou Gehrig, as well as Yankees owner Colonel Jacob Ruppert. The governor engaged in a jocular back and forth with the Bambino, who proclaimed that his season was all over except a little barnstorming. Straightening his tie and preparing to depart for a rail tour of the Midwest and the South, where he would be giving campaign speeches, Al Smith shot back, "That's what I'm going to do too." Then Smith made a confession. "Babe, I wish I could get as many kids to cheer for me as cheer for you. I'd be a most happy man." "Shucks, Governor," Ruth buoyantly responded. "I've got all the kids cheering for you too." So what was going on here? In 2019, a Los Angeles Times columnist reminded their readers that Babe Ruth's support for Smith is sometimes considered the first noteworthy celebrity presidential endorsement. We'll note a few earlier, but that this is a big moment. In any case, that column in 2019 also derided Ruth's endorsement as inconsequential. Quote, "If you don't recognize Smith's name," and first of all, in Albany, if you don't recognize Smith's name, get out. But in California, maybe you can get away with that. "And if you don't recognize Smith's name, it's because he didn't win." Indeed, it is unlikely that Babe Ruth's support for Al Smith swayed a significant number of votes in 1928. And yet, this early mixing of sports and presidential politics did hail the onset of a rather modern phenomenon: the rise of celebrity athletes as potential representatives of particular reference groups' aspirations, ambitions, and political attitudes. And so Ruth, and indeed other athletes who entered into the political arena in 1928, were embarking on a subtle and early form of what we later call identity politics. While organized sports had burst onto the American scene in the Gilded Age and had captivated the country for generations, in the words of the great historian William Leuchtenberg, who I'll say parenthetically is a friend and also just turned 100 and is still writing and doing great stuff, he put it this way: "It wasn't until the 1920s that spectator sports took on a central role in American life." As you just heard, there's a building spree, Yankee Stadium, but think of the Rose Bowl, think of Los Angeles Coliseum, think of Soldier Field, et cetera, et cetera. Think of the fact that in 1927 at Soldier Field, they had a boxing match, Tunney Dempsey 2, sold 150,000 tickets, and if you translate to today's money, the box office take, it was over $40 million. That compares to like some of the biggest boxing matches of all time. Of course, baseball was king at that time. And in that sport, the standout was Babe Ruth, who had mesmerized fans in stadiums or those reading the sports pages in their living rooms at home with all the records that Steve outlined a moment ago. And beyond those remarkable numbers, Babe Ruth transcended sports in a decade when sport was, as we've heard, emerging as modern, mainstream mass entertainment. As the popular syndicated columnist and self-styled cowboy philosopher Will Rogers put it, "It just don't seem like we have any game in America where one man stands out so prominently and so far ahead of all the others in his line as Ruth does in baseball. He is the most colorful athlete we have in any branch of sports. Moreover, while Ruth's emergence as a 1920s folk hero proceeded initially from his record-smashing athletic achievements, his mythological status was fueled just as much by the way in which he engaged with the public sphere in a manner that appeared to align authentically with his own humble origins, some of which are depicted here. As Will Rogers suggested, kids are crazy about Ruth, and he's always doing something to keep solid with them. Raised himself in an orphan's home in Baltimore, he has always kept a keen interest and sympathy with kids. Indeed, Historians and biographers recognize that Babe Ruth was the first athlete to be as famous as a celebrity as he was for his athletic accomplishments. Babe Ruth was a public figure. He was marketed, he self-marketed, he endorsed products. Other people used his name to endorse their products and then ended up in court. He had a vaudeville show. He was in movies. As the biographer Jane Levy put it, he was, quote, thoroughly modern in the creation, manipulation, and exploitation of his public image at the precise moment in history when mass media was redefining what it meant to be public. In short, by the time he endorsed Al Smith for president, Babe Ruth was one of the most famous people in America. In part, then, the story of Ruth and other athletes' involvement in presidential politics fits with a broader story of celebrity culture and celebrity endorsements in 1928. When Governor Smith secured the Democratic nomination, a flurry of congratulatory telegrams arrived at his suite at the Biltmore. Some of these cheers came from celebrities like the comedian Ed Wynn and the internationally renowned Irish tenor John McCormack. Indeed, Smith's support from the entertainment world would include some of the leading songwriters of the era of the century, like Irving Berlin, and Broadway luminaries like Jerome Kern and George M. Cohan and the Gershwin brothers. For his part, Babe Ruth sent a laudatory telegram extolling the Democratic Party's choice, you see the choice there, as one that assures us that public opinion demands a good president. There were a few celebrities who went for the Republican Herbert Hoover, but not nearly as many, although it is worth mentioning briefly that Hoover did score the endorsement of probably the one person in America more famous than Babe Ruth, the aviator Charles Lindbergh, who the previous year had done the transatlantic flight, and whose endorsement of Hoover inspired the campaign theme, "If he's good enough for Lindy, he's good enough for me." For his part, Herbert Hoover sagely recognized the growing national culture of celebrity. He read the signs of the times very well, at least at this moment, maybe not later. And he recognized the latent political potential of the culture of celebrity. He had become a celebrity as food administrator during the First World War, and then as commerce secretary. He hired a publicity agent in 1926. The following year, his work on Mississippi flood relief made him even more than ever, in the words of a biographer, a celebrity, and clearly a front-runner to be Republican nominee in 28. Hoover's party, moreover, had been the ones that were innovative when it came to using modern media and advertising. 1920, Warren Harding, and a lot of historians see this as the last old-fashioned front porch campaign, but in fact, it got transformed when he hired Albert Lasker, a pioneering ad executive, and Lasker used a savvy public relations blitz. They filmed Warren Harding interacting with people and then pushed that out to theaters around the country. And by the way, Lasker, who you can see with Harding and Babe Ruth, Lasker also recognized the growing appeal of sports. This is 3 years later, but in 1920, Lasker, who by the way is the majority owner of the Cubs, so he's in on all of this, he filmed Harding golfing because he said that'll make him more appealing. And they staged a game. Now, he's got one team at his disposal because he owns the Cubs. So they go out to Marion, Ohio, Harding's hometown, and it's the Cubs against, and he tries to get one of his rivals in the National League. Nobody will do it. This is goofy. We're not doing it. So he gets the Kerrigan Taylors from the minor league, but nevertheless, they have film footage of Warren Harding playing catch with the star pitcher, Grover Cleveland Alexander. Presumably for the moment they forgave the Democratic origins of his name. Harding's campaign harnessed the culture of celebrity. Al Jolson and Mary Pickford were endorsing him, and indeed Al Jolson wrote a campaign theme for Harding as well as for his successor, Calvin Coolidge. Despite these earlier Republican innovations, 1928 was going to look different. Hoover was running to maintain, at this point, a conservative status quo. And personally, despite his previous celebrity, he lacked the zeal for politics that characterized his opponent. And so Republicans and Democrats in 1928 were engaging with different components of the emerging mass culture and the culture of celebrity. Hoover's campaign focused on technology. They use radio broadcasts, they use films, a limited role for personal appearances by their nominee. But Smith energetically sought to maintain direct contact with the people through a series of robust policy speeches and exuberant politicking at mass rallies all around the country, confirming his well-known reputation as the happy warrior. Contrastingly, Hoover's campaign was seen at the time as much less spectacular. It had less speeches, and many found the technocratic nominee colorless. So the Democrats were going to be the one this time who used personality. Some newspapers derisively, when Smith came to town, said, oh, people are just there to see a celebrity. And they used that personality more in 1928, and that included celebrity athletes. And for the most part, it was the inimitable Ruth who characteristically hogged the headlines. For example, this picture is from 1933, years after everything we're talking about, when then former President Hoover and the Bambino pleasantly attending the USC-Stanford football game. In 1928, a photographer had sought a similar snapshot, but to no avail. In early September, Babe Ruth, in the heat of a pennant race, was approached by a photographer inquiring if he would pose for a photo with Herbert Hoover, who had stepped away from his own race to take in the Senators' Yankees game at Griffith Stadium. "Nothing doing, I'm for Al Smith," recoiled Babe Ruth. A few days later, Ruth apologized for this impertinence, probably at the urging of his agent. But the New York Times sports columnist John Kieran concluded that the episode confirms the suspicion that the whole Yankee team went Democratic months ago. And Kieran was proven prophetic on October the 7th, when during the World Series, most of the Yankees team signed and shared a statement endorsing their governor for president. Now, although Yankee manager Miller Huggins was a rare but also quiet Hoover supporter in the Yankee dugout, 5 other managers signed onto this statement, including Wilbert Robinson of Brooklyn, for whom, parenthetically, the team was temporarily nicknamed not the Dodgers, but rather the Robins, after their manager, and also future Yankees manager, currently the Cubs manager at this time, Joe McCarthy. And also, I'll say, probably the most famous manager at this time, New York Giants manager John McGraw also signed in, and a lot of players from around the league. The connections between Al Smith and the Yankees in particular were not new. Al Smith threw out the ceremonial first pitch to open Yankee Stadium back in April of 1923. And Yankee owner Jacob Ruppert was actually a former Democratic congressman who had been supported in 4 successful campaigns by the Tammany Hall political machine, of which Al Smith was a prominent member. Later, Colonel Ruppert sent the governor season passes to Yankee Stadium for 1924-25 up through 28, a fact of which I am aware only through the help of archivist and friend Keith Swaney, who was able to help with some of this research of mine during the pandemic. And I want to take a moment, parenthetically, to publicly thank all of the archivists, librarians, museum historians who behind the scenes kept our entire discipline alive during those dark years. And anybody here who appreciates that, I think we should applaud for them, because I couldn't have done my... Well, the Al Smith boom in the sporting world transcended the Yankees. and it transcended baseball. The so-called champions of Al Smith, as they were dubbed in campaign propaganda, included golf champions and champion boxers, Olympians, pro and college football players, coaches like the legendary Newt Rockne, and a whole host of baseball stars, led, of course, by Babe Ruth. It reads like a blue book of professional sports with a few top-notch amateurs mixed in the list, effused Atlanta Constitution sports columnist Dick Hawkins. Many of these athletes were doing this because they were urged to do so by their manager, their agent, really the first real mega sports agent, Christy Walsh, who had made many of these people into public figures and celebrities. Walsh himself was actually a Republican, but he was an ardent Irish Catholic, and in this case, identity for him meant that, as we'll see in a moment, a lot of people saw in Al Smith their aspirations for a more pluralistic vision of America. And I'll say this was borne out again in some very affectionate letters that Walsh wrote to Smith that are housed upstairs. Ruth was far more engaged. I said a lot of these people are like Smith supporters, they sign something, they get a picture, they move on with their lives. Babe Ruth really was actually engaged with all of this, which is something that people find surprising. On October the 19th, he took to the airwaves to announce that he had temporarily renounced the world of baseball in favor of politics over a nationwide radio broadcast live from WJZ studios in New York City. Jovially greeting radio friends, and especially you folks who rooted for the Yankees in that little affair at Sportsman's Park last week, Ruth noted a new trend that had emerged in his voluminous fan mail. He said, so far I've gotten 14,000 wires and letters that have come in since I hit those 3 lucky home runs. Generally, in the past, my letters have been about one subject, baseball. But this time the letters and telegrams mix baseball and politics. Now, actually, Babe Ruth himself had been stirring this cocktail because on the Yankee train coming home from their victory in St. Louis, they stopped in many towns along the way and were hailed in many places. And from the back of the train, Babe Ruth was delivering impromptu campaign speeches for Al Smith. The response, according to Ruth, had been positive. He claimed that he got 7,000 letters approving of what he did and only 200 against it. But in reality, Ruth's stumping for Smith, who, as I'm sure you probably know, was viewed skeptically by many Americans as a caricature of the urban ethnic Northeast that many of them feared. Ruth's campaigning along the rail line from St. Louis to New York often drew a frosty response from Midwestern audiences. But the Babe did not walk back his politics. When a crowd, for example, in Terre Haute, Indiana, stared silently after the champion's pro-Smith oration, he reportedly looked at them, bellowed, "The hell with you," pivoted, and went back to the revelry on the Yankees train. In his radio address, Ruth disregarded such controversies and sought instead to invoke his common man credentials on Smith's behalf. He said, I don't know anything about tariff and those kinds of things, but whether you are a farmer, a manufacturer, or a baseball player, the main thing that interests a fellow in voting is how it will affect his pocketbook. True enough. But he awkwardly derailed the potential universal application of this sentiment when he tied it squarely to his own wealth. Governor Smith's friendship for baseball has made big crowds and big salaries possible, and that's why nearly every big league baseball player is going to vote for Al Smith. That doesn't have the universal appeal. Sticking to income but broadening his horizons, the champion lamented that, quote, Smith, who has done more for New York than all the ball players in captivity, does not get the salary of many big league players. And this allowed Babe Ruth to arrive, however circuitously, at a more fundamental point. While some men desert their old friends, their hometown, and their obligations for great salaries, Al Smith has given his life to the public. And as an example of Smith's service, Ruth, of course, awkwardly went back to the fact that Babe Ruth had helped to make Sunday baseball legal in New York. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Nevertheless, Babe Ruth wasn't here, as he kept going, to talk about Al Smith as a friend of athletes, as much as a friend of the common working American. And this broader invocation of working class identity is what really matters about his endorsement. Here's something else he said. The other day I took a ride down to Oliver Street in New York City just to look at the little 2x4 home that Governor Smith was born in. It reminded me of my own 2x4 home in Baltimore. And what a wonderful thing it is to think that whether you were raised by poor parents in Oliver Street, New York, or by poor parents on the riverfront in Baltimore, there's a chance for every boy to get to the top in America, whether he wants to be a president or a ball player. This matters because Americans were well aware of Governor Smith's biography, right? These are some, well, I didn't take that one, but these are some snapshots I took. Like, in his late teens, he was working 12-hour shifts, started at 4 in the morning at the Fulton Fish Market, partly because a few years earlier he dropped out of school in 8th grade to support his family because it was the only way they could make ends meet. And so it gives you goosebumps if you go to St. James School on the Lower East Side and you see the plaques on the door where it says Governor Smith attended this school. It was here he received his only formal education. Well, a lot of Americans found that inspiring and relatable. And I think this key portion of Ruth's endorsement is the most meaningful and probably the most heartfelt. If we look back to 1924, when Al Smith tried to get the Democratic nomination but failed, Al Smith's supporters had reached out to Babe Ruth even then, and he wrote a little letter of support. But the letter said, "No poor boy can go any too high in this world to suit me." And Babe Ruth was not alone in feeling this way. As I've said, Al Smith was a poor grandson of immigrants. He had risen from the sidewalks of the Lower East Side to become chief executive of the Empire State. His biography was familiar and inspiring to millions of Americans who found themselves marginalized by the 1920s chauvinistic cult of 100% Americanism, an ideology that excluded the urban, ethnic, largely Catholic and Jewish working class citizens who were placing so much hope in Al Smith. Meanwhile, it's been written by many other historians, this is not new from me, that while sports were increasingly popular among all segments of society in the 20s, they were particularly appealing to those same marginalized Americans as a sort of countercurrent against nativist Protestant nationalism that sought to affirm old puritanical attitudes that, as one historian put it, equated play with sin. All of this was reinforced by the fact that, of course, as I'm sure you know, Al Smith was the first Catholic nominated by a major party for president. And in the nativist 1920s, his candidacy was targeted by a bombardment of bigotry. The Ku Klux Klan is burning crosses to heckle his campaign appearances. There's a whispering campaign around the country questioning his patriotism and that of his co-communicants. You can see the Democrats pushed back. By class, ethnicity, and creed, many athletes hailed from the same world as those marginalized Americans who increasingly viewed Al Smith as their political champion. Ruth himself, as you have heard, was a grandson of German immigrants, had endured an intensely difficult youth, a broken home, 6 siblings who died in childhood on the insalubrious waterfront of Baltimore, which, by the way, was the last major city in America to get sewers, so that was part of the problem. And he lived in St. Mary's Industrial School. He shared Smith's disdain for prohibition, and he also shared Smith's Catholicism. While Ruth's celebrity appeal was supposed to transcend any particular demographic niche, some of his teammates did not. And their support for Al Smith seemed to be more identity-oriented. Yankee rookie Leo DeRocher, a French-Canadian-American from the industrial enclave of West Springfield, Massachusetts, He campaigned for Al Smith back home, and he does it in those neighborhoods. And actually, this is the election when those communities, and I'll talk more about it in a moment, flip. They had been staunchly Republican, and they're becoming Democrat. That's not because of Leo DeRocher, but he's one of these people who's responding to these dynamics and what Smith seems to stand for. Bigger star at the time, second baseman Tony Lazzeri, called by the historian Lawrence Baldassaro the first major star of Italian descent in the national pastime and one of the game's first ethnic heroes. Lazzeri also entered the political fray for Al Smith. He was drawing large numbers of first and second generation Italian Americans to the ballpark for the first time. He was providing a newfound sense of pride at a time when the stereotypical depictions of Italian Americans in American culture were not very pleasant. And now he was joining Babe Ruth on the radio along with Lou Gehrig, who parenthetically was himself a child of German immigrants from the ethnic enclave Yorkville on the east side of Manhattan, who himself had lost 3 siblings in childhood. Well, on one occasion, at least, Lazzeri, in a radio sort of jocular and kind of edgy back and forth with Babe Ruth, he actually specifically singled out Italian Americans are rallying to Babe Ruth this year. Right? So some people are even more specific. In these and other ways, the significance of identity, the identity of the potential voters and of the campaigning athletes, was important to how their messages were received, even for the more universally themed speeches of the more universally renowned Babe Ruth. There was predictable enthusiasm for what he had to say from Democratic quarters. Baltimore Sun reported on the part where he talked about being a boy in Baltimore. The Boston Globe zeroed in actually on Babe Ruth's discussion of a referendum in Massachusetts to legalize Sunday sports, in which he pointed out that Governor Smith had done that in New York in 1919. In Georgia, on the other hand, where such defiance of strict Sabbatarianism was not as politically useful, the Atlanta Constitution, which still was very democratic, ignored the Sunday sports talk and just said that Babe Ruth had hit a homer for Al Smith. The reviews, though, were not universally affirmative. As I said, there are large parts of the country that view Al Smith skeptically. And Smith's campaign was trying to get Republican voters to vote for him in rural parts of like the Midwest. And they thought they could do it because farmers were struggling. But they're skeptical because he is a Catholic, because he's from the Lower East Side, because of his New York accent that doesn't translate well to them on the radio, because he had criticized the immigration quotas from 1924 as discriminatory, et cetera, et cetera. His association with Tammany, his urbanism. I mean, for heaven's sake, his campaign theme song is the sidewalks of New York. Or he's not pretending he's somebody he's not, but that might be making some voters skeptical. Babe Ruth, as I'm sure you can imagine, was not helpful in overcoming such concerns. A frustrated Missouri farmer who thought all this made it harder to convince their neighbors to switch over to the Democrats fumed to the press. Some fool put Babe Ruth on the radio the other night, and he talked about Al Smith giving us Sunday baseball. Sunday baseball's all right, but people out here don't think so. This part of the country believes in going to church on Sunday and Sunday school and Sunday observance, not Sunday baseball. This talk was divisive, and it made a lot of people skeptical of Governor Smith in the country. It's worth mentioning, though, it was something that also was meaningful to a lot of other Americans at a time when you have a lot of Americans who are working 48 hours a week. Their only day off might be Sunday for recreation. Sunday baseball is actually quite meaningful, even if it's not for you to make money off of it. It had become a sort of culture clash in many cities around America in these years. And there were a lot of people who recognized the ethnocultural implications of endorsements in these years, including Babe Ruth's. And some people, like the Missouri farmer, were dismayed about this. Others had negative reviews about Babe Ruth's campaigning because they were derisive of the messenger. The Los Angeles Times, a staunchly Republican organ, loftily concluded that Babe Ruth is lost in a game in which he cannot use his stick. He is not permitted to drive voters home to the polls with his ponderous slat. As a pinch hitter for the Democrats, he is likely to strike out. Ruth's identity was thus as an athlete and nothing else. He had nothing in such a view to contribute to presidential politics. It was their generation's version of shut up and dribble. Undeterred by such jeers, Babe Ruth just kept going. As you can see, he was photographed wearing Smith's signature brown derby and a Vote for Al Smith badge. He went campaigning into Louisville, Kentucky with former Democratic nominee John W. Davis on October 24th. Now, this is a laugher. Inadvertently injecting an element of anarchy into an otherwise unremarkable oration by Davis, Babe's getting bored. He's moving around in his chair, and he just blows up his chair. I mean, he nearly falls off the stage. People are freaking out. They bring him, in the words of the press, a more substantial chair. And his response to this is to send the governor a telegram, ignoring that debacle, and instead saying things went really well in Kentucky, but then he wired him this encouragement. You're speaking tomorrow in Boston. I know you will get the warmest reception of the entire campaign because Boston loves a fearless, hard, clear fighter, fittingly, as they wind down and as I wind down, I assure you. Babe Ruth played the role of opening act for Smith's final rally, helping to close out the governor's campaign just as he had closed out the World Series a month earlier. At Madison Square Garden in New York, the slugger provided a stellar attraction as he served as song and cheerleader, warming up the audience prior to the 8 o'clock speech, the last speech of the campaign for Al Smith, prior to the arrival of Mayor Jimmy Walker, gubernatorial nominee FDR, et cetera, all these luminaries. It is just Babe Ruth and this 25,000 people in the audience. Now, I want you to imagine, you are part of these Americans I've described who feel marginalized, but you have a lot of hope in Al Smith, especially it's his hometown. So he's your governor. You know this guy. You know not only that he has called for a more pluralistic view of America and denounced the KKK, but you also know that he has fought for 4 terms to make your life better with all sorts of labor regulations and all sorts of social welfare initiatives and conservation. I mean, we can go to the list. That's a different talk. And you're hoping this is going to go national, right? That intersection of class and ethnicity. And there's this enthusiasm. About 2 million people are on the streets to cheer for him as he's on his way home, as he's on his way to Madison Square Garden. And then, if you're lucky enough to go into this arena, you think he's going to win. You think this is going to be the moment for you. You're on the precipice here. And here's the biggest star in America up there, and you're all together. And look, I'm really happy there's so many people. So if you know the tune, sing along with it. And you're all going, East Side, West Side, all right, so nobody knows the tune. But in any case, the energy, the ecstasy of the audience just explodes as Smith walks in and they're cheering. 3 days later, Smith lost in a landslide. Now, despite his crushing defeat, this is a different story, but I'll just say parenthetically, a lot of Americans switch over to the Democrats because they're excited about what he has to say. It changes voting patterns in urban America, in marginal communities. They note at the time, and we confirm later, Italian-American voters, Jewish-American voters, French-Canadian, Polish. You keep going down the line. They all suddenly become Democrats, and they remain, these working-class Americans become Democrats. It's crystallized in the FDR years, and that lasts for multiple generations. And while they're at it in New England, the same people who helped him win Massachusetts, which was a staunchly Republican state back then, those same people also voted to get rid of the prohibition against Sunday sports. To conclude, as for Babe Ruth, he largely avoided, not completely, but largely avoided major politics after 1928. You can still see he still fraternized with Al once in a while. They went golfing together in Coral Gables, Florida, and he still had some scorn reserved for Herbert Hoover. By 1930, when the United States had plunged into the Great Depression and Babe Ruth was in the middle of trying to get a raise from the Yankees, the Bambino was reminded by the media that the president of the United States in a depression makes less than the $80,000 a year that you're asking for? Babe Ruth responded, quote, "What the hell does Hoover have to do with it? And besides, I had a better year than he did." Quite accurate. The pioneering celebrity athlete endorsement by Babe Ruth, and others I've noted, was likely of minimal consequence to the outcome in 1928. But what matters here is that in a decade when sports had emerged as a wildly popular form of mass entertainment, some athletes were choosing to leverage their fame to articulate perspectives that resonated with working class and ethnic Americans from a unique position of simultaneous authenticity, because they really are from that world, and privilege, because unlike a lot of other people, they have a forum, a voice, a name that's well known. When the Los Angeles Times dismissed the viewpoint of Babe Ruth and suggested he return to swinging his ponderous slat, they were essentially demanding the ballplayer defer to supposedly wiser minds in our democracy. Such condescension paralleled that of high-handed mill managers in New England and industrialists around the country who displayed Hoover posters inside of the workshops or included Republican campaign propaganda threateningly in their workers' pay envelopes. In this instance, Ruth and a growing number of working class Americans decided not to keep their heads down and go quietly back to work, whether that work was in a textile mill or in the batter's box. Thank you very much.
Hey, we have a few minutes for questions if anyone's interested.
This is a long shot. You had a picture of Yankee Stadium, and the flags were at half-mast. Any idea?
Was it my picture?
Yeah.
I don't. I'll have to look.
I didn't think so, but I noticed right away.
I did notice. I'll have to go back and look and figure out where that picture's from.
Thank you. You mentioned that Babe Ruth was among the first kind of celebrity athletes. I'm wondering what what athletes did after Babe Ruth. Do they point to him as an example of, well, Babe Ruth campaigned for so and so? Did it really spark kind of a wave of athletes to come forward?
That's a great question. You really don't have a ton of major activism from athletes. You get that in a later generation, and again, it's often tied to identity. But at this time, it's not like an outpouring. Oh, Babe Ruth has shown us the way to get involved. If anything, like I said, it didn't change a lot of votes, but it also didn't really change the sort of cultural relationship between these guys and politics at that moment. What I think it does show is this sort of whisper of this sort of pattern that we see grow over time at a moment when, again, in the 1920s, these things are really, there's a really fierce, what we would today call culture wars going on. But I would be lying if I said that this created this, opened the gates. I will say, however, and I'm not here to sell anything because this book that's coming out is very expensive. I wrote an essay about this, and it's in a book that's coming out it's called The Sporting Presidency. And there is actually some of it is about presidents who are interested in sports, but some of it is about specific athletes and their engagement with different politicians. One of the most famous later on is Jackie Robinson, who's associated with a lot of politicians, including Governor Rockefeller, actually works for Governor Rockefeller. And that generation you see a lot more, and a lot more important and a lot more meaningful than what you see here. This is only early. yeah, I wish this was like, oh, and by the way, nobody knew this, but I discovered this really great. That'd be really cool. But I still think it's meaningful in a subtler way. But yeah, thank you. It was a really good question.
You said that Babe Ruth was very involved into the politics. Do you think if it wasn't for his high involvedness, Al Smith wouldn't have had so many athletes like kind of with him?
That's a great question. I would say I have two superficially contradictory answers to that, but I think I can square this. On the one hand, these guys, there's like 70,000 slides, so this might take a while, but all these guys on the champions, come on, champions, I know they're up here. Oh, there they are. See, I missed them. Those guys are there because Christy Walsh has made these people famous. He's made them wealthy, and he is an entrepreneur, and he's all in for Al. And that's probably originally the Babe Ruth story too. However, Babe Ruth does throw himself into this, and he does go on the radio. And the fact that you have more involvement from a Tony Lazzari or a Lou Gehrig, they don't just sign something and then disappear. I think that can be partly attributed to Babe Ruth opening this. So I guess maybe that would be the answer to your question is for some of these Yankees, it actually does make a difference. I would, and it's not something that's sustained in the long term, but I think yes, for a couple of people would be my answer. It's a really good question.
Do you guys take questions about hitting mechanics?
I was a great fielder when I was a kid, but
What about hitting?
I can't help you with hitting.
How did Babe Ruth hit so many home runs? It had to be an approach, right? I mean, he wasn't that much stronger, right? And eventually guys started to catch up with him, but they never fully caught up. But it had to be like launch angle, right?
Well, no, it's we who are raised in Baltimore just have there's something about growing up in Baltimore that makes you tough and strong. I don't know. I'll say, by the way, Jennifer's going to kill me when she sees how long I went. I apologize, but hopefully you had a good time. This is a great story, I hope. But I grew up an Orioles fan, and then my in-laws are all Mets fans. So as an Orioles/Mets fan, it kind of hurts to talk about all these World Series for the Yankees. But I know there's a lot of Yankee people here. So anyway, I can't. You might know. I mean, you're the sports curator. So.
I'm also a Mets fan, so it was very painful to talk about the Yankees. I don't know if it was necessarily mechanics, but Ruth definitely had a different approach than baseball at the time. I mean, it was small ball until Ruth came around, and I don't know if there was really a secret to it. I don't know if anybody's really kind of looked to see if it was a launch angle or maybe it was just he had so much, not power, but he was just kind of this personality that went full blast with everything he did. So he just had so much energy that he probably just only knew one speed, and that was hitting home runs, it seemed like. But that's a good question.